Hey, welcome to Quick Answers with Craig. This is a simple, encouraging way to answer the questions that people are asking. Now, when you hear that phrase, quick answers, I don't want you to think of simple answers. No, these are very complex answers to complex questions. We just do them real quickly. So today's question is a really good one. I know God has forgiven me for my sins, but how can I begin to forgive myself? And that's a great question. So frequently in his epistles, Paul the Apostle, who wrote 13 out of 27 New Testament books, he goes to great lengths to try to describe what we call Christian liberty. So in these matters of life where God allows us freedom, like God doesn't set down specific laws prohibiting something, or he doesn't command a certain something, the Apostle Paul warns us against being judgmental towards our brothers. And he gives us this example of the Corinthian community that he writes in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And they're arguing about whether or not they can eat meat that's offered to idols. Some said, no, it's defiled. You can't eat that. And Paul says, man, this has nothing to do with the kingdom of God. He says, those of you who have scruples and all kinds of fights and quarrels about it, he said, don't judge those who don't, and don't vice versa. Don't judge the others. So this is a case where you just have to respect one another. And it's in those admonitions that Paul uses as his basis this statement. He says, we're not to be judging people for whom Christ died. And he reminds us, your brother or your sister belongs to Christ. God has forgiven them. So my question is this. When you ask the question, how can I begin to forgive myself? Who are you to withhold forgiveness from someone whom God has forgiven? So let's look at it this way. Let's say if somebody sins against me and that person repents, well, God's going to forgive them. If I refuse to forgive them, can you imagine how terrible that is in the sight of God? Like, God's not obligated to forgive that person. That person sinned against God, and God has never sinned against anybody. And here I am, a person who is a sinner, and I'm refusing to forgive other sinners, while God, who is sinless, is willing to forgive. Like, have you ever stopped to think about the arrogance that's in me when I refuse to forgive somebody that God has forgiven? Now, how could you not forgive yourself after God has forgiven you? I've had people come to me through the years and say, you know what, I committed such and such sin, and I asked God to forgive me, and I've asked him 10 times to forgive me, but I still feel like I'm not forgiven. What am I to do? Listen, I don't have any brilliant theological answer to that. I can only tell them you need to ask God to forgive you one more time. And when they say, I've done that, I tell them this time I want them to ask God to forgive them for their arrogance. And they say, arrogance? Like, what do you mean arrogance? I'm the most humble man in America. I've confessed this sin 10 times. Well, doesn't God say that if you confess a sin one time, he'll forgive you? Like, who are you to refuse the forgiveness of God? Who are you to condemn the one that God has forgiven? That's arrogance. Listen, you may not feel arrogant. You may not mean to be arrogant. You may be rolling in humility with all of your confession. But I'm telling you, if you refuse to forgive the person God's forgiven, that's arrogance. God has forgiven you. It's your duty to forgive yourself. It's not an option. You have to forgive those whom God forgives, including yourself. That's Quick Answers with Craig. Make sure you subscribe to this channel. If you've not yet subscribed, you can hit the button in the top, the bell in the top, to be alerted with all notifications as we let out more and more material. We'll see you next time.